Anna Seawald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, what it means to be a feminist dad. In the words of my guest, fatherhood is at the root of patriarchy. And until we're ready to take a long, hard look at what it means to be a dad, we're not going to be able to deal with the evils of misogyny, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. Jordan Shapiro is a senior fellow for the John Gans Cooney Center for Sesame Workshop and non-resident fellow in the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. He teaches in Temple University's Intellectual Heritage Program. Shapiro wrote a column for Forbes on global education, digital play, and family life from 2012 to 2017. His previous book, The New Childhood, received wide critical acclaim and has been published in 11 languages. And I admit I have not read his first book. He's a father to 2 children and stepfather to 2 more. He lives in Philadelphia with his partner, Amanda Steinberg. His new book is called Father Figure: How to Be a Feminist Dad. The book is as provocative and norm-shattering as it sounds. So is my fascinating and thought-provoking conversation with him. On this episode, we talked about how feminism liberates everyone, not just women, how patriarchy is hurting men too, and he shares the 4 tenets, the 4 principles of a feminist dad: critical consciousness, responsive fathering, anti-gender essentialism, rigorous inclusivity. I think it's worth mentioning the definition of feminism that Shapiro uses in his book. He says that it's one of his favorite definitions. It's from acclaimed author, theorist, professor, and social activist Bell Hooks. Quote, "Simply put, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression." End of quote. Jordan states how straightforward this statement is, not complicated, scary, and unwelcoming. It also doesn't suggest a battle between men and women. In the beginning of his book, he writes, "I'll be honest, at first becoming a feminist dad hurts a lot. But in the long run, it's liberating." Please enjoy this deep, fascinating, and thought-provoking conversation with Jordan Shapiro. Jordan, welcome to the podcast. I am excited to have you on today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. First, let's start with the title of your book, Father Figure: How to Be a Feminist Dad. Did you come up with the title or the publisher?
Well, the main title, Father Figure, was there from the very beginning, from when I first pitched it. But it did take us a very long time to figure out what the right subtitle was, and a lot of back and forth, and a lot of arguing, and a lot of deep thinking about what would both represent the point of the book without also alienating too many readers.
Oh, I see. To me, like, father figure means a replacement of a father. Right? I mean, isn't it? I'm not a native English speaker. Let's start from that. I could be wrong. But in my understanding, father figure is someone who is not your real father, or could be your real father, but it's a standing in there for a father. Am I
Yeah.
misunderstanding this?
I mean, I think it's come to mean that, especially because of the George Michael song, which played with the sort of sexual notion of father figure as a romantic or sexual partner. But I think more what it really means literally has to do with the person who plays the role of father in your life, whether that's a biological paternal figure or a non-biological paternal figure. So yeah, I mean, I certainly wanted to, from the very beginning, thought of that George Michael song, listened to it very much while I was writing the book, and liked the idea of playing with something that would make people think, that would make them go, wait, what does this even mean? So,
Oh, good. So you got yeah, I got it. Who did you write this book for?
who did I write it for? I mean, that's always a hard question, because I think as an author, you really start by writing a book for yourself, and then but you have to also always be thoughtful about who the potential audience is, and so you can't just write for yourself. It's otherwise nobody would read it. So it was something between the book I wanted to write, the ideas I wanted to explore, and how to make sure that they were accessible to others. At the beginning of the book, I think the goal was very much I was looking around at the world. I was looking around at a world that was really going through a lot of existential crisis. So we live in a world where gender is being renegotiated and questioned and really thought about in really deep ways. And what I started to notice is I would talk to my friends, men, fathers, men who weren't fathers, was that a lot of them were really confused about how to make sense of their identity at a time when the world was going through these weird, I shouldn't call it weird, going through these complex debates. So I kind of wanted to help men navigate that. But as I wrote the book and got more and more into it, I don't think it was, well, certainly not just for cisgender men, but for anyone who identifies as a man. But then also, I think for anyone else, honestly, so many issues came up as I did research that I thought would be really useful and helpful for anyone to read as they think about the notion of how ideas about gender shape our family structures, shape the way we think about parenting, and shape the way we think about being partners or spouses or family members.
You did quite a bit of research in this book. Like, you go deep. You go into Greek mythology, Freud, psychology, a lot of places. It was very fascinating. I think it's a groundbreaking book, definitely unique in its kind and very fresh. So congratulations on that. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
I was hesitant to read at first, but then I'm like, wow, wait, this is pretty smart and well put together and very, very deep.
I've heard that from a lot, especially from women, especially from feminist thinkers who when I was reading it. I have some friends who are really well known feminist thinkers who told me that they opened it ready to like find a million things wrong with it, that they didn't even want to like it, but then they in the end they turned out they did, and that speaks to all the research that I did. I mean, the stuff, the Freud and the mythology stuff you mentioned, that stuff I've been studying for years. I teach it at the university level, so that part was sort of easy. I knew exactly where to look for all the research, but I had to read a lot about gender and a lot about queer theory, which I think people don't realize how much is in this book, because I don't really frame the book in that way. But the queer theorists, I think, have done some of the best work and the freshest work and the most interesting work on gender. And unfortunately, because we live in a world that's so binary and so heteronormative, that a lot of people think queer theory must all be about queerness, when really I think it has a ton to offer anyone, because it forces us to rethink how we live in relationship to the narratives of gender identity with which we operate. And so, so much of this book, it was about helping people feel comfortable. I don't want anyone to think this is a book about trying to say, hey, you can't identify as a man, or you must identify as a feminist, or you have to suddenly be like, I'm non-binary. None of it. This is not a book about what you have to be, as much as how you can reconcile how you imagine yourself with a world that's changing, and how to do that in the most inclusive and compassionate, kind, thoughtful way.
Yeah, the world is changing for sure. So in the process of researching, writing, thinking about this book, were there any of your own prejudices, biases, myths that you knew about things that you sort of unraveled, dispelled, that was surprising for yourself too?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think most of the book is surprising for myself. In general, when I write, and anything I write, even when I did my previous book, The New Childhood, I cut most things that I already knew, right? Because I'm trying to write the things that make people go, hey, I haven't heard it discussed in this particular way. I haven't thought about it in this particular way. And that means always having to push my own ideas to places where I hadn't thought about before. So, while there's some stuff that was really familiar to me, I certainly studied a lot of feminist critical theory in college and in graduate school. To really put it together in this way was all new to me. And while it was something I wanted to look at, I really hadn't. I mean, some of the stuff, I'm trying to think about what an example I can give you that was really shocking to me. I mean, almost all of the third part of the book, which is the part that focuses on fathers and daughters, was really, the stuff that I discovered was really shocking to me.
That was like my favorite part of the book.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that, because many people say it's the part that makes them the most uncomfortable. And it's sort of like, I feel like I can divide those people who talk to me in terms of those who were put off by Section 3 and those who were onto it. And I guess I should say a bit for your listeners about what I uncovered in Section 3. I mean, for one thing, this was all new to me because while I have a stepdaughter, I don't have a daughter but a biological daughter, and I've only lived with my stepdaughter for about a year, so I hadn't really thought a lot about the relationship. I mean, I certainly had thought about it from the perspective of parenting expert, but I hadn't thought about it from the perspective of someone who has to live with it and think about how they interact with a daughter all the time. And what's shocking in this section, I think, is I uncovered a history of daddy-daughter relationships that's really problematic. And the story that I go into in detail is around the mid 20th century, the 1940s, probably a little bit. And moving into the 50s, what happens is many of these ideas we have, like the idea of the father figure, the idea that you'd be attracted to your dad or have daddy issues, or this whole kind of Oedipal notion of what I call in the book, daddy-daughter eroticism. Really, that's when it arises, right? This idea of, you don't find it in anything older, because there was a very clear idea that happened in the mid 20th century where American psychoanalysts decided that there was a second Oedipal experience that happened for teenage girls, and that their entire sexual image, health, well-being was dependent on how they related to their daughters. So that's where we start to get these things like, well, the daddy-daughter dance existed before that, but certainly became a major idea in pop culture around that time. The idea of the father giving away the daughter, right? That's very, very well. It comes before that. It's still pretty modern. It's still pretty much industrial age, right? Most traditional societies, if you think about weddings, what would happen is all the women would come from one side, all the men would, this idea that dad is a girl's first lover, right? I don't mean that, obviously literally, but symbolically and psychologically, and is just a really problematic idea for so many reasons. And you hear it from people all the time, right? They'll tell their daughters, find someone who loves you exactly how I do.
Oh boy.
And it's just, to me, it became, whoa, like that's not an equal relationship. It's sort of like immediately building in this patriarchal authority into the way they think about relating to men forever. And that's really, it's troublesome in so many ways. And of course, I really break it down in the book. I break it down in how that's reflected in the way we think about commerce, in the way we think of consumerism, in the way we think about sex, in the way we think about romance, in the way we, and how those things end up reflecting in so many things about that we have shown statistically are problematic in the unequal distribution of power, labor, self-worth within the traditional hetero-monogamous marriage.
The daddy-daughter dance. I was just interviewing someone yesterday about marriage divorce, and I mentioned this, that, like marriage, if you look at this, how people get married, it's still the same. I mean, we have such open ideas about marriage, divorce, half the people divorce and all of that. But those traditional things like the daddy-daughter dance, all those, we're so progressive seemingly, but yet we perpetuate all of those old traditions. And I questioned that. I didn't get married like that. I didn't have a wedding. I have different ideas about materialism, consumerism, and all of those things. But like we continue those traditions without questioning them, right? That's one thing. Then there are those T-shirts that a man wears. If a guy comes, asks your daughter out, you do this. Have you seen those
yes,
the T-shirts? Yes. I can't remember exactly, but when you were speaking, I pictured this, ragged dad, the tough guy. You have to come ask permission to marry the daughter or go out. Even if you're in middle school and things like that. I love your perspective on a lot of things that, we need to question those things. Why are we perpetuating this stuff?
Yeah, and once you really start to, for anyone who reads this section of the book, I think you'll discover what I discovered writing it, which is you can barely watch television anymore without seeing these, this, like, especially this daddy-daughter thing, like reinforced over and over and over, and often in shows that are mostly good, right? Like I think about there's something I call the good bad dad, which is we see all over TV, this dad who's so loving, so caring, always trying to do the right thing, and then you have these like weird, unconscious, under the radar things. But the only thing I want to say to what you just said is something that really interests me, at least in both Father Figure and The New Childhood, that made me write both of these books, was the fact that many of these ideas of what we consider traditional, and I would like, if they could see us, I'd put that in air quotes, right? Traditional families, they're not nearly as traditional as we think, right? They're mostly industrial age ideas, right? So they have like 100, 150 years of being the norm. And the idea that we are so so committed to something that that has only been there for such a little time, but it feels to us like something unquestionable, right?
But why are we so committed?
Well, this is something that I think about a lot and try to unpack in the book, although I wish I could have done it more clearly. It's really hard to express. Often what happens when we, in any part of culture, whenever you start to set up cultural roles, whether they're around gender, whether they're around race, whether they're around ethnicity, you also need to create a story that makes people think that they are immutable, that they can't be changed, that they're inevitable. And often we do that by creating some kind of origin story, right? So we either we use a religious origin story where we go, well, it says it in the Bible, so therefore that's how it's always been, or we use a sort of anthropological, archaeological one where we go, if you look back at ancient civilizations, they've always done it this way, so therefore we have to keep it. And nowadays we even do do it with what I, scientific mythology, right? And but I say mythology here as because it's a complete lie often, where we go, evolutionary psychology tells us that this is the only way humans can be. The bottom line is there's nothing cultural. Any cultural norms are flexible and can be changed, and we get to choose the ones we want. But in order for us to choose them, we often have to feel like they're right. And to feel like they're right, we need to have narratives that make them feel like that they've been there forever. And so once that happens, it becomes very hard to break them, because you feel like you're breaking something old. You hear this so much in gender, where people used to say to me when I was writing the book, aren't you changing things that have been here for thousands of years? And isn't that going to, and I'm like, well, no, they haven't been here for thousands of years. Certainly there's been misogyny for thousands of years. Certainly gender equality has been inequality has been around for a very, very long time, but it has never looked the same. I mean, it's always changing, right? Patriarchy is not a fixed thing. Even American patriarchy has changed in my own lifetime so many ways. And I'm not that old. I mean, I'm not young, but I'm not that old. So I think about my father and my grandfather and think about how many different versions of gender roles they've lived through, and it reminds you then that we have the power to change anything. But unfortunately, we like to believe that the things we're doing are permanent. It's this weird thing about, at least modern humans. I'd have to think about whether or not it's always been the case, but at least industrial age and post-industrial humans is that we are both obsessed with change, right? We love revolution. We love to reinvent ourselves. We love going to spiritual retreats where we're like, I'm going to completely change myself and have a completely different outlook on the world tomorrow. And then at the same time, we are terrified to change anything. We want to buy new products and replace everything. I need a new phone. I want to change everything all the time. But then at the same time, there's so many things that we are terrified to shift. And I find that really fascinating. And so I think I'm often writing about that tension and how we can navigate it in ways that better serve our psychological health.
Yeah, change. You're right. Yeah, I think it comes down to those two tendencies that we have, two needs, I guess, humans have. We love security, stability, but then it becomes boring. We also want novelty and curiosity and intrigue and playfulness, right? So
and progress and innovation
and innovation and change and progress. But then where is the line, right? I still want my comfort, but I also want that. And so you can't have it both ways. So maybe this is deeply human, because if we don't change, the people who are married, they're dreaming about their exes and wanting to have a free life and open marriages. I was talking to someone yesterday about this. But then when they transgress or something happens, they come back to their family because it's more stable. Their marriage is better than what was out there. And so this applies, I think, to all human behavior, right? The comfort is good. It feels good, but then it becomes stagnant. When it becomes too much stifling and boring, then you want that change. And then you go out there and it's like too scary, because fundamentally we're vulnerable human beings. And then we run back to our little secure base in anything. I think it's just that balance of the safety and the threat system and the new and the old. That's how I think. I think these are not mutually exclusive. I think we have both, right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think again, I'd have to really do some work and some research to decide if I think this is something that's always been true about humans, but absolutely at this moment in time. And I might argue, if I were to do the research, I'd be looking into whether or not we could define consciousness itself as this sort of idea of keeping one foot stable in the past and remembering everything that came before. The ideas, all the things we learned from our parents, language itself, right, is something we take from the past and continue to use in new contexts. But then at the same time, we always want to get to those new contexts. We always want to get to something better. We want to always get to something new. I suspect that this is always true. It's in this sort of dream about immortality. It's sort of in the dream about loss. We know that every generation, even absolutely since the beginning of writing, has been lamenting what's lost as we move into the future, lamenting what new technologies ruin, and we're lamenting what new ideas are destroying about the essential human experience. We have so much of that going back even to the early Greeks, even to the ancient philosophers are already starting to have this discussion about as we move forward, what do we lose? And so I think that's at the core is we want to move forward. We also don't want to lose anything.
Yeah, at the core is that safety and threat systems. I think that's how the brain is wired. I think maybe that's how I see it. Everything new threatens the system, right? It's too shocking. If it's drastically new, then it's like, you don't feel safe, you feel vulnerable. Even if you look from an attachment theory perspective, a little toddler who starts to walk and wobble and explore, what do they do? The mommy is in the room, toddler goes, a few feet away, explores, and then checks if mommy is there, then comes back to mommy and then goes a little further. And every time comes, checks in with mommy, the safe, secure place, and then goes further. And so I think that's our natural human tendency for safety and security, but also exploration. Right. That's how I view it. And you can, apply it from relationships to anything new, technology. This template, I think, is just wired in us. Marriage, anything. The safety and of the stability, the security of what's known or what I have, it's comforting, but also the new, exploring, that's also enticing. And so
I think that's true. And I think if you take that out to a larger cultural level, if you look at it from a sort of meta perspective, I think it's very clear that we're living at a very strange time where we are on the one hand, sort of more open when it comes to questions of sex and gender and sexuality than ever before. And at the other hand, also more reactive to it, right? at the same time, right? Like we're very, if you look at the whole culture and imagine humanity as a sort of a single organism, then what you see is a lot of fighting and anger while also being able to talk about things we've never been able to talk about. There's less repressed than ever before, and yet more effort towards repression than ever before.
True.
And often by the same people. Like, don't think that it's a sort of partisan thing, right? You on both sides of any debate. I think everyone is at the same time both really reactive in a way that they haven't been in the past, and also really open in a way they haven't been in the past.
True. I agree with that. In the book, you write about, speaking of daddy-daughter dance, you write about this, about your grandma, your mom and her father, who used to send her chocolates on Valentine's Day. So share that story a little bit and your take on it.
Well, there were always these heart-shaped chocolate boxes that arrived at our house by mail around Valentine's Day. And I had two older brothers, and we loved them, of course, because, it was a very different time. I'm 43 years old, and we just did not have the access. It's not like now where like you can get candy anytime you want. Certainly we could go to stores and get candy every time we want, but they didn't arrive by mail. It wasn't like the Amazon age where things arrive by mail all the time. So here would come these fancy big chocolate boxes, and we loved to go through them. And you had to figure out what you were going to eat. Was it a jelly? Was it a cream? Was it a nougat? And is it a caramel? And we would have these like sibling rivalries over who got what. And you weren't allowed to take a bite and put it back, although we often did just to mess with each other. But what always made me question this was, I couldn't quite understand why it would make sense for a parent to buy something for a kid for Valentine's Day, right? Like it didn't seemed like that kind of it was a holiday that was about sort of erotic romance. So like, why was that going on? And that was part of what got me to this, to really trying to find the research of when did that start. And I found out it's pretty common. It's pretty common, and that you can trace it both to what I was just talking about, the psychoanalytic move towards this sort of second Oedipal experience in the life of a daughter that which, I'm not saying that exists. I'm saying the experts decided that it existed in really troublesome ways. But what I also discovered is it was very much linked to the way consumerism was changing, the way advertising was changing. It happened around the same time as 17 magazine, which started to identify the teen daughter as really a viable customer that was worth advertising to, because she was able to bat her eyebrows and get daddy to buy anything. And that's that's where it came from. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating how many of these little things we have that we give so little thought to. And that's what so much of Father Figure is about, sort of unpacking the things in the father's relationship, not just to daughters, but to sons, to gender nonconforming children, to their spouses, the way that the fatherhood identity, when it is embodied by men with good intentions, and the way that they sort of enact those good intentions, the way that the habits of mind, the way they think about themselves, really what happens if we unpack and look at what's underlying that. And I was sort of shocked when I started to write the book and doing research and looking all over to try to go, just to find research. I teach at a major university. I have access to a humongous library and databases, and I remember just trying to find things about this. And there were some. I don't want to pretend like I'm the first there, but very, very little compared to so many other things that I've researched in the past. And I thought, well, if we're this far into feminist movements, and we're pretty far into them, right? Like it's about 200 years now of serious feminist movements. If we're this far into it, and it's hard to find anyone that's really looking at the father, when the word we use is patriarchy, which literally means rule by the father. I was like, we need to do it. I should say, I just remembered as I was saying this, that in the very early ideas of the book, I loved the name Father Figure, because in some ways that's the literal translation of patriarchy, right? Pater, it means father, and arc actually means shape more than it means rule, right? It means both at the same time. It sort of means to structure. So I kind of like this idea that it's a figure, it's a shape, it's the way that we figure, it's the way that think of it like a figure eight, right? Like the figure of fatherhood and how it shapes all of our lives.
Mm. I've seen on Instagram you have some merchandise around the book that there is like a button that says "Cancel Patriarchy." I love I love that. I think you should distribute everywhere.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with thinking about the swag and the merchandise that we wanted to use to promote the book. And I can, some of them were silly, some of them are funny. I like the one that says "Man up to feminism" and has a little picture of a uterus. I don't know. There's so many things. There were certainly some that we decided we had to not use because we didn't think, we were afraid people would go, oh, what if this isn't in jest? What if they might take it too seriously? I thought about doing one that said, "Stop being a pussy and start fighting the patriarchy," which of course I didn't mean seriously, but we decided not to make that because we were afraid some people might misunderstand what we were doing with that. And we had a lot of other ideas too. And it's always it's this hard thing about how do you write a book like this that wants to be really, really serious and important in its intentions, but you also want to have fun, and you also don't want to be afraid to laugh, and you also want it to be amusing and entertaining and pleasurable to read and pleasurable to think about. And so that's always the line that I was walking while writing it, while promoting it, while doing all of these things. I would love to make a million jokes, but if I make too many jokes, then people might think I'm not being serious enough about it. And if I'm too serious, people might think I'm too serious. It's always a hard line with anything that's an important conversation, because it's charged with emotions and energy and all the things that trigger us.
Yeah. So, what's the feedback to the book? Do you get, particularly the negative, critical pushback? Like, that's what I'm interested. Like, what do people say, if any? Did it get in the
Yeah,
hands of those, critical thinkers, the critics that are who would be offended by those, buttons and the things that you created?
I mean, it's been mixed. I think a lot of the critics don't even bother reading it. Like, I've certainly gotten a lot of trolling on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, but I kind of they're sort of so stupid in the way that they present those, that I don't put much stake in them. They don't have much sway for me. The sort of people who are like, that's so stupid, man, there's no such thing as a feminist man. I can ignore those people. I've gotten some criticism. The ones that sort of do cause me to think, and have certainly I've thought a lot about is the question about whether there's a level of appropriation as a man writing a book about feminism. I am certain. I'm making money off of gender inequality, right? And there's something sort of inherently problematic there. I acknowledge that that's a reasonable criticism. I sort of take the stance on that one of this is a fight we all need to get involved in, and there's nothing wrong with getting paid for your work, and I don't really think I'm exploiting feminism. I'm deeply committed to it, but I think it's certainly a valid concern that makes me put a lot of thinking in how I decide to discuss it, how I decide to talk about the ideas. I'm trying to think of other criticism I've gotten. I mean, mostly I would say that most people who have read the book have been pretty positive on it. As I said, a lot of people, friends and non-friends, who have said to me, I didn't believe that there could be a good book by a man about feminism. And also there's a whole tradition of books about masculinity that take a very different stance, one that was always problematic to me, right? It's this sort of the books about masculinity tend to be much more like, oh my God, it's so hard to be a man. It's just sort of like, it's so hard to be a man because of the way we think about masculinity. And there's certainly absolutely validity in that concern, but it has also always seemed to me crazy for men in what's obviously a patriarchal society to be able to take on a victim role and go, this is hard for me to be a man. I mean, there's lots that is difficult. There are challenges, but that's not the same as being being a victim of the culture, I think. So it's another line I walked a lot in this book. I wanted to say, here's what's hard about being a dad. Here's where the cultural norms have made you become a father in a way that doesn't suit your family, that's not in the best interest of your own psychological well-being, that's not healthy for anyone in your family. But I also didn't want that to be, hey, it's so hard to be a man, because it's not hard to be a man. I mean, it's hard to be some men depending on your situation in the world, but it's not but being a man is a leg up.
Yeah, you're right that patriarchy hurts men too.
Absolutely. It absolutely does. If I really wanted to explain that quickly, I would say we have these ideas about what ideal pinnacle of masculinity is. And I don't have to explain what they all are. I think everyone knows them, but just so you understand what I'm talking about, right? This is the alpha male narrative, right? The idea that you're supposed to be king of the mountain, king of the house, right? Who wears the pants in the family, or who gets to dominate other people, and how do you show strength? And of course, this idea of being the strong, stoic patriarch is completely unattainable. It's impossible to attain. It is. And the reason it's impossible to attain is because it's dependent on the idea that there will always be a single alpha male at the top of the hierarchy, which means nobody, well, I guess one person can achieve it. Everybody else, by definition, is going to fail. And so what happens is men walk around with this sense of self-loathing, right? Because all of us, no matter who we are, have places where we're not in that role. Yeah, you might be in, you may have a very patriarchal, powerful role in your own family, but when you get to work, you still have a boss who's in charge of you. When you get to, no matter how high up you are, you see this in politics when you have world leaders who are then upset that the media is able to criticize them, right? Even they have the opponents that have some power over them. And if anyone has power over you, you're not achieving that masculine ideal. So men walk around sort of hating themselves, feeling terrible about the fact that they have failed to achieve manliness. And that ends up, one, creating really terrible feelings within the individual, issues with self-worth and self-loathing. But then also what happens is you end up trying to keep projecting or reinforcing your authority wherever you can. So often what happens in families is that fathers end up going, well, I am stronger than everyone in my family. And since I'm the low man on the totem pole at work, when I get home, I'm going to prove that I'm in charge. And that's bad for their spouses and their children. And in the worst cases, that becomes really terrible and abusive. I think in most cases, what it becomes is, statistically, there's many cases where that becomes very abusive, either emotionally or physically. But in the cases where it's not so terrible, it becomes the things that I'm talking about in this book, these places where the well-meaning, good dad who doesn't want to perpetuate any abuse or any of any kind, whether emotional or physical, is still inadvertently and unconsciously reinforcing problematic attitudes that are integrated into patriarchal thinking that end up making them unhappy and their families unhappy.
Yeah, I mean, if you're walking around with those feelings of unworthiness and frustration, and I'm not good enough, I don't have enough power, right? It's a lot of emotions to keep inside because you have to be tough. You're a man, right?
Right.
You can't show emotions. You can't be vulnerable. And first of all, that's number one. Number two, no one teaches boys. Now it's changing. Even if you were to feel your emotions, it was not allowed, that there were not no models for that, how to be with your feelings. So being vulnerable is not good. Having emotions is not good. So bottling up is good. That's why, they die of heart attacks and all sorts of cardiovascular diseases. And of course, if you bottle it up, it's going to come out, right? In other ways, in a destructive way that it's going to harm those who you really love the most. And you're not going to feel good after that. So it has this negative, toxic cycle. And yeah,
it's a loop. I like to call it a loop of shame.
Yes,
a loop of shame. And I just want to be clear, since we did bring up the sort of more the familiar idea of masculinity, men's work, all those things. There seems to be this myth in there that men aren't allowed to be emotional because we don't value emotion in men. But the truth is, we don't value emotion in anyone, right? Right. We may allow it from women, but it becomes part of the idea that they should therefore be dominated, right? Because they are weak because of their emotions, right? So it's not this world where we encourage it in anyone, right? We don't actually like it in anyone, and that's really problematic because being emotional, being vulnerable, is not necessarily a sign of well, I shouldn't even say not necessarily necessarily. It's not a sign of weakness. I mean, there is such a thing as weakness. I'm not trying to say nobody's weak, but feeling the normal gamut of human emotions is not a sign of weakness. The ability to think about those emotions, articulate them, deal with them in responsible, thoughtful, meaningful, and ways that don't disrupt the people in your community is where the strength is. Holding it in is not the way to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, something came to me. I knew this family, a large family. They would wait for their father to come home so that everybody would gather up together and eat dinner. They would, this was their tradition. It was very, and it had to be done a certain way. Everybody had their seat at the table, and the father had to sit first. And you can't leave the table when you wanted to. It was very, very. When you were speaking about those things, that just came to me.
And of course, there's nothing wrong with those sort of family dinner rituals. If you want to have a ritual where that's important to your family, but when it's all revolving around a single individual, that's a problem. In my family, we absolutely have dinner as a family all together, and no one can leave until everyone's done. But it has very little. Well, it has one thing to do with me, which is I cook it. But
I know. I see that you love cooking adventures. Not to digress too much, but I know you live in Philadelphia and Reading. What is that station?
Reading Terminal Market.
I know. I've been there multiple times, and you had a store there, right? I
had a diner. It's still there. It's just not mine anymore. I had a diner that was there. It was the only sit down restaurant. I mean, there's counters there, but the only sit down restaurant there, and it was very, very busy. And what we did was we would cook traditional American diner food using only ingredients that we bought from the farmers in the market. So it was all fresh from scratch. We didn't have a freezer. We didn't have a microwave. We didn't, we didn't buy things. I mean, we bought some things in boxes, like, the occasional canned thing like ketchup, right? But we didn't, but we certainly, almost everything was from fresh ingredients. That was the idea. And we were doing that long before the fresh local trend had really taken over. It's still a great place. It's still one of the best breakfasts in the city of Philadelphia.
Oh, wow. I think I've eaten breakfast there. I attended the podcast movement conference in 2018 and we stayed at the Marriott Hotel. It was right there, and we would eat all our meals there. It's a fun place.
It's a great place. When I was a kid, when I was first learning to cook as a kid, it wasn't like today where you can sort of go into any grocery store, no matter how fancy or not fancy it is. And you can nowadays find something organic, some fancy, dried mushrooms, all the spices you want. That's not how the world was when I was a kid. And so I used to go there a lot as a kid, just because it was the only place to get certain things. You wanted a wild mushroom, you had to go to the Reading Terminal Market. Nowadays, you can get them anywhere.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So what does it mean to be a feminist dad? What are the tenets of a feminist dad? I am positive the listener is wanting to know at this point in the conversation. You have 4 main tenets to being feminist dad. Can you briefly give an overview?
Yeah, we'll see if I can remember them all in order. I'm sure I can remember them all. I don't know if I can do it in the same order I do it in the book, but let's see. Number 1 is a commitment to critical consciousness. And this is, critical consciousness. This is an idea that I took from Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator. And it's this idea that you need to be conscious of the systems in which you participate. So many of us participate in systems, social systems, cultural systems that we don't really think much about. They start to define who we are, how we think of ourselves, and we spend very little time considering them. And so the number 1 is this sort of commitment to critical consciousness, not just in thinking about your role as dad, but also to teach your children that they need to think about critical consciousness, right? What's their role in any sort of systemic community that they're a part of? I do this when I'm teaching. I do this all the time. I actually start almost every class every semester by by going, we're going to play a role-playing game where I'm going to pretend to be the professor and you pretend to be the students. And you can raise your hand and ask questions. I'll give you these great, and I sort of go through the sort of description of what we're doing, only to remind them that it's a university. These are adults sitting in a room with an adult, and they're choosing to participate in a structure of inequality. It's not inherent. It's not, and that's a sort of perfect example of what critical consciousness makes us do, is go, we can choose or not choose to be in this structure, but it is not something that that is inevitable. So that's number one. Number two, is a commitment to breaking down what I call locker room gender essentialism in the book. And this is this idea, we were just talking about the idea of these origin stories. Gender essentialism is the idea that there's something inherent about the way that that you behave, the way you think about sex, the way you think about your roles, the way you think about what you're capable of, that comes from sex, right? That comes from gender, right? That women are one way, men are another way. It's all been debunked. Okay, there is nothing where that is true, and there's no male brain, there's no female brain, we sometimes people talk about it in terms of hormones. We all have all the hormones and they do different things in different bodies, but there's no one of the examples I use in the book, just to sort of be a little bit shocking, is like, men have estrogen. Erections are caused by estrogen. So I don't know how you can now call it estrogen, the female hormone, if you need it to produce sperm and erections, right? So we all need it. We all have both. I call it locker room gender essentialism, because so many of the ideas I realized while writing this book were ideas I learned in the locker room when I was 12 and 13 years old, and some boy would be like, well, girls like it when you say this, and boys like, and I took up so many of these things for granted until I finally did some research and went, whoa, I always thought that was true. It's not true at all. And so I call it locker room gender essentialism.
I love that. I love that expression.
Yeah. Because the truth is, while there are some, and I should just say this because I'm sure we have listeners who are going, that's not true. Right. There are certainly things that statistically are more common in one biological sex than the other, so like if you look at all the men and all the women and pick some trait, you might find that it is more likely to show up in a man, but that doesn't mean that every man has it. And in fact, there are many more traits that are more that go down the middle in both of us than there are any that only come in one or the other. I mean, there's none that only come in one or the other.
But don't you think there is a difference in how men and women are? I mean, the way women are known to be more emotional than men, right? About different things. And maybe it's because of our hormones and the cycle. That's one of the common.
So that's one of the common assumptions.
Assumptions. Yeah. Is it cultural? But
yes.
Okay.
Well, I'll give you a perfect example. So they did some studies, right? So one of the common ones is that men are less empathetic than women, right? This is sort of caught up in the idea that women are innate nurturers, that they're there's some mothering instinct that makes them into caring, nurturing people. Well, so they did this. They did a study where they created some empathy metrics, and they asked a bunch of men blindly and a bunch of women, how do they feel about this, and this? And in that case, it certainly did come out equally among the as we would think about it, right? Women seem to be more empathetic. Then they did another thing, which they told a bunch of men that it was a contest to see who could be more empathetic. And they beat the women every time, which proves they're perfectly capable of the empathy as long as it's framed in the right cultural narrative for which for them to play. Another example is we often will say men are natural risk takers, for example, right? Well, that really depends on how you define risky, right? If I was who's more likely to skydive? Yeah, culturally, many men might say choose that over women. But if I was to say who's more likely to try a brand new recipe on a first date, right? If you consider that risk taking, that's a very different kind of, then where do you think, right? So a lot of these things, it all depends on how you think about the question. And of course, there've been a ton of studies that break down almost all of these tropes. As a philosopher, my what I've always said is almost all of them are, well, as soon as we ask the question, we're already using a kind of cultural definition that is not going to work when we get down to the biology anyway. We're only going to see how the biology behaves in correlation with the cultural definition, because empathy and caring haven't even looked the same for all of human history. So, in ancient Greece, if you were in ancient Sparta, it would have been considered the only good parenting would have been to turn your child into a heartless warrior, right? So who's going to be better at that? Well, I have no idea because I wasn't in ancient Sparta, but it certainly doesn't equal out to our normal conception of gender.
There was this comedian, I can't think of it. He talks about the male brain. He jokes about it, that the male brain is like, there are little boxes, there are little compartments, and men compartmentalize things. Women, it's more like a jumble of things, and they keep everything in mind, and it's just like, looks very messy, their brain. I mean, there is some truth to that. I don't know culturally or not, but like experientially, men are very straightforward. If you want your husband to go to the store, you tell them exactly what you want. If you tell them, hey, can you buy salad? It's not going to be the right kind of salad, whatever you asked. I think.
Yeah, but if your husband, are you married?
Yes.
If your husband were to send you to the hardware store and tell you to get screws, would it be the right one?
I would do my research. I would find out.
I guess, look, the bottom line is that absolutely when we believe that many of these things are separated by gender or sex, what happens is we teach the skills that go with it, right? So so certainly all those things resonate with people as biological differences, because it is going to absolutely be true that you're going to see more of those things from the people who have had more practice with them, right? Like as we said earlier, we don't teach men to think about their feelings and to communicate their feelings, right? Well, if we don't teach them how to do it, how do we expect them to be good at doing it, right? So
it
what happens
confirms
is
the bias, right? We don't teach, and then it later confirms the bias that they're not good.
And then for generations, it repeats.
Yeah.
Right,
true.
until we start to think it's true. But when they've really looked at brains, when they've really looked at hormones, what you find is that it doesn't really hold up biologically, which is not the same as saying our experience is not that currently among people. And the point is, there's nothing wrong in my mind about there being different roles. There's nothing wrong with the idea, if we want to have a society in which women are more empathetic and men are more straightforward, that's totally fine, as long as that's not causing inequality, as long as that's not silencing people, as long as that's not leaving other people to not live a fully autonomous life. Right now, it very much is, because we've decided that all the power lies with those traits that we think are inherently male. If there's plenty of cultures that sometimes do split gender roles in a way that doesn't lead to oppression and exploitation all the time. Right now, ours does.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
So you spoke about the two of the tenants. What are the other two?
Yeah, I think I did them out of order too, but I told you that would probably happen, but it doesn't matter because the order doesn't, the one doesn't build upon the other. They all happen simultaneously. Responsive fathering is the next one that comes to mind. This is it should really be called responsive parenting, because it's not gender specific in any way, but it is a book about fathers. So I called it responsive fathering in the book. And this is the idea that our job, it's what it sounds like. You're supposed to respond to rather than define other people's experience. So if you think about often in parenting, we think it's our job to be the authority. And the distinction I use in the book is between authority and responsibility. And I argue it is not our job to be the authority over our kids. It is our job to be responsible for our kids, which sometimes means absolutely we may have to be a little bit authoritative here and there, but or at least dominant here and there as parents. But like we have to scream at them, don't run across the street when there's traffic coming. Right. We have to say, hey, do your homework. We have to say, hey, it's time for bed. We have to set boundaries that are in the best interest of their growth, well-being, development. But often we think of that as authority. And the word authority comes from the word author. It doesn't come from the word author. They both come from the same Greek root, autos, which means self. And and we often think our job as fathers or as parents is to define the story of our families, right? To write the story for them, to tell them who they're supposed to be, to control them. And instead, what we need to be doing is responding to the individuals that are in front of us. For example, one of the hardest places that I talk about in the book for fathers to do this is we often want to give our kids really well-meaning advice, right? We often want to play this sort of father knows best role, and we do it with the best of intentions of trying to tell them what's right. But really, we need to be responding to them and helping guide them towards what's right. Because I think we've all remember being teenagers where our parents told us do this and we did the other thing because we didn't like the way they told us. And then eventually, as we became older, we went, oh, my parents were totally right. They knew what they were talking about, right? They were trying to stop the mistakes, but it doesn't do anything to try to write someone else's story. It works to respond to someone else's story. And as I said, I don't want anyone to hear that as sort of hippy dippy, right? Like, because sometimes the right response is to set very firm boundaries, but it needs to be in response, not because you already know how your children's life is supposed to proceed. And so another way I talk about this in the book is that the way that we think about fathering is often that everybody's story revolves around the father, right? Like he's the protagonist of the story and everybody else is following. And a lot of some people read this and went, do you really know anyone who's like that? And I was like, yeah, I know everyone I know is sort of like that, at least in some ways. For example, you might ask yourself, if you're listening to this, where do you live? And do you live there because of the husband's job or because of the wife's job? In fact, if you look statistically, most families in the US live where the husband's job is, even if the mother makes way more money, right? It still ends up being like, which is the priority narrative, even if it might not be the priority career. And so what I'm pointing out there is that men need to recognize, especially fathers, that everybody considers themselves the hero of their own story. And that, in fact, because your children and your wife and your partner consider themselves to be the hero of their own story, you might be the villain in their story. You might just be the comedic sidekick. You might just be the mentor. I mean, you could be any of these roles, and you need to acknowledge that and do that well. Often I think one of the biggest issues in terms of men who are resistant to feminist theory, resistant to gender equity concepts, is because they see themselves as the hero of the story and they're always doing well. And then they suddenly turn on the TV and they hear some reporter point out that they're the villain, and they can't reconcile in their heads how you could be both the hero and the villain. But the fact is, we are all heroes in some stories and villains in others. And so responsive parenting is about acknowledging that and responding to the colliding myths in which you find yourselves.
Yeah, it's a heavy burden to live like that as a man, carrying all of that. I just can't imagine living like that. It must be very, very, very heavy.
I think it is. It
right?
is. And another place I think that a lot of men, I'm sure there's some listening now, who think everything I do is about making life easier for my family. I try to make them comfortable. I try to, I mow the lawn. So there's, I spray for mosquitoes. I buy food. I do everything I do is about making the perfect experience for these people I love so much. Well, it's really quickly that the idea of trying to make the perfect experience from a place of caring can become a kind of controlling. And that's what I'm encouraging with this idea of responsive parenting, is to acknowledge the difference, and really be attentive to whether or not you've crossed the line between caretaking to controlling, right?
Yeah. As I always say, it's serving you or your child.
Yeah.
Like being overly helpful is the sunny side of control.
Exactly.
Like, yeah. And what's the fourth one? So responsive parenting, don't worry, it aligns with we talk about on the podcast. It's aligned with our philosophy. So you are not something hippy dippy, as you said. So what's the fourth one? I forgot the fourth one.
The fourth one is in some ways the most important one to me, which is just radical inclusivity. And that became so important to me. Writing this book was for the whole time was so important to me. We often think feminism or gender equality is really just cisgender equality, just hetero cisgender equality, right? Like men and women should be equal. But there's a lot of inequality and oppression and exploitation in the world. Trans folks are one of the most discriminated against groups, I would say, right? Currently, right? Almost invisible, not considered normal in any way. Gender non-binary. Right? When you're talking about gender, you got to be sort of about the equality of anyone, however they want to imagine their gender. But then there's all the other ones, right? Whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's racism, whether it's ethnic cleansing, right? All these things, you need to be committed to. Everyone deserves to live a life of dignity and autonomy. You don't have to like the life they live. I'm not trying to tell your listeners like you must embrace and love them. I'm just saying you must be committed to letting everyone live a life of dignity. You may think certain kinds of religions are really terrible and evil. That's a bad, I don't think that, but you might. And I don't even have any problem with you thinking that. You're allowed to have whatever opinion you want, as long as your opinion doesn't get in the way of other people living a life of dignity, autonomy, agency, and freedom. And to me, that's core. And when that comes to being a father figure or a dad, that means showing your kids that all the time. I'll just use a stupid example for this one, which is from the time my kids were very little, anytime I drove through a toll booth. And nowadays, after the pandemic, there aren't even toll booth operators. But back then, anytime I drove through a toll booth, I made like a big deal so that my kids would see it of going, "Hi, how are you today?" And looking that person in the eye who was taking my quarter and making eye contact and treating them as a human being, not just the machine that takes my money while I wait for the lift gate to open. Again, it's a simple thing. But what I was hoping to model for my kids is every person deserves the same level of respect that I would give to your grandmother, the same level of respect that I would give your mother, the same level of respect that I would give to your teacher. Even if the interaction is just a 5-second drive through a toll booth, you still look at that person and go, "You're a human who deserves my respect."
Yeah. Speaking of parenting your children, so is this how you raised your children? Were you thinking about those ideas? Were the ideas brewing in your mind ever since you became a dad, or at some point you shifted a lot of things? And your children are teenagers, right? I saw one of them is driving already. Congratulations. So how do you bring this into your life as a parent, on a practical level? Give me an example of a conversation, or what's their response to the book?
Yeah, sure. To some extent, all these ideas have always been at the core of my thinking about parenting. They certainly were not it took a long time to figure out how to articulate them into a book, but it was always at the core of how I thought about things. And one of the things about the book, which but I when other people buy Father Figure and read it, what they're going to discover is that it is full of examples of mistakes, right? I tell all these stories.
It starts with the mistake, actually. It's like it starts with you yelling at your kids to get up and get ready in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, everything about the book is, I remember when I was writing it, of course, when I was writing it, lots of our dinner table conversations were about gender and equality and feminism. And I remember one of the kids saying to me, "So are you the only person who's not patriarchal?" And I'm like, no, every chapter starts with a story of where I made a mistake. And it's about how do you unpack those mistakes and make the necessary changes. They were a little shocked by that because they really thought this was gonna be like my previous book, which was mostly stories. When I told stories about my family, they were stories about what we did right. This one's full of places where I do things wrong, and how I think about them. These things are woven into our everyday life. And when I wrote the book, what was really important to me was that I wasn't offering a sort of stupid prescriptive, here's the 10 things you can say to your daughter to make her have self-confidence, right? Because those things are always sort of silly. They don't think about the context. I really wanted to write a book that taught men the practical skills they needed to interrogate their own behaviors, their own habits of mind, and to make the decisions that they're perfectly capable of making, right? Once they think that through. And of course, that's going to look different in every family. My kids, they go back and forth about whether or not they think this book is exciting or not. There's certainly moments where they said things like, "It's a little cringe to call yourself a feminist dad, don't you think?"
Especially if you don't have daughters, it's kind of like, wait, what are you doing, Dad? Yeah.
There was a point where one of them said, "Have you and your publisher do you not think that aren't you a little bit nervous about putting this out this way?" I mean.
It's needed. I think it's needed.
That's what I talked to them about how it was important to me to take the hard stance. The example I used to explain that to them is I think my kids are really, really admirable and brave when it comes to issues of equality. And they will tell me stories about things that happen in the normal everyday social life of a preteen and a teen, in terms of whether there's homophobic slurs, whether they're making fun of people because of disabilities or looks, or all the things that we know are problematic in the way that teens jockey for status. And we've also had a lot of talks about how hard it is to stand up to that, right? It's not always in your best interest in the social game of middle school or high school to stand up for that. And we've had a lot about, when do you do it? When don't you? When do you need to? When, and some, I'm always saying, of course, these things exist because people don't stand up for them. But I also acknowledge that it's not easy to be an 11-year-old and break down and try to fight the whole system. And so I did explain to them that, yes, putting Feminist Dad was me going, I have a level of privilege. I have privilege as a man. I have privilege as a man, as a white man. I have privilege as a published author who's able to be published by a major publishing house to be able to do a lot of things. And what I wanted to do with that privilege was stand up and go, we need feminist dads, and be the one who's willing to put themselves out there, because I don't have to fear the social alienation that I had to fear when I was in college or middle school or high school, like my kids do now. And so they totally got that, and I think they were kind of proud because it made them think of all the times they wish they could stand up to the class bully, but they were afraid they'd become the target if they didn't. And I think it's really important. That's what that radical inclusivity idea is about. We need to prepare kids so that when they become adults, they're not afraid to be the ones who can use whatever power and authority they have to stand up for injustice, especially for a family like mine, which is a very privileged American family. I mean, me and my kids have, we really, I mean, we certainly have wants, but but we don't have needs. We've been unbelievably fortunate and blessed and privileged, and I want my kids to know that you need to wield that privilege and leverage that privilege, not just economic privilege, but also male privilege and white privilege. You can't get rid of it. You don't have to feel ashamed of it. It's not your fault that it's there, but you do have to use it for good.
Yeah, great lesson. Definitely. Have you ever thought about having daughters, like being a dad for girls?
Well, I do have a stepdaughter now who lives here with me, and so I'm thinking a lot about it, and I'm learning a lot about it. We get along very, very well, and I try to do what I do with in some ways it's the same as what I would do and what I've always done with the boys, which is an ability to allow their voice to be heard, to allow them to have a sense of agency, to be willing to explore any identity, any thoughts that they need to, and to be there to be the Sherpa that helps them do that and encourages them to do that in positive ways. Of course, it's about very different ideas because of the cultural gender things, but ultimately the goal is the same. There's a lot of things I have to think about really, really deeply, about questions of like, how do we perpetuate body image issues among girls, and what do I say? What am I saying? And of course, I think we all, anyone who's ever read like a New York Times article about parenting knows, you focus on intelligence rather than looks, right? But what about the deeper stuff, right? What about the like places where you might say something about someone you see on TV, and the way you might tell them about, how you might describe inappropriate clothing, right? Are you saying it's inappropriate because it's too cold out, or because you think they're showing too much skin? Either way, you have to really think about what messages are you sending, and how do you respond to those really difficult issues. And especially for me, to be someone who's so committed to wanting to end gender oppression, gender exploitation, gender discrimination, but also has to reconcile that with the realities of what it means to live in a patriarchal, misogynist culture. And how do you then steer a young person to make decisions that don't start, here's a perfect example. There's so much been written about what happens when teenage girls start to acknowledge that their body is always at the end of the male gaze, and how that shuts down their sense of self-worth, how they start to define themselves based on how other people react to their beauty. This is not just a question of like, fat shaming or all those, but just in general, you'd be the most beautiful girl in the world, but at some point you grow up realizing, oh crap, my self-worth is defined by how other people see me. How do we make sure that we allow a child to not be devastated by that realization, while also having to acknowledge that until we fix the world, that's still an actual thing that happens. You can't just be like, I refuse to accept it.
Wow, what great conversation, Jordan. I really enjoyed it. I want to let you go at some point. I want to be respectful of your time. A fascinating book, groundbreaking, fresh, father figure, how to be a feminist dad. Where can the listener find you, your website, your social media usernames?
Yeah, so you can find everything you want about me by going to feministdadbook.com, and feministdadbook.com. It won't work to just go to Feminist Dad. It's got to be feministdadbook.com, and that will send you to that sends you to my website, the page about father figure, but then all the other things are also there at feministdadbook.com. And then if you want to follow me on social media, I am on all the social media platforms. I'm pretty active, especially on Twitter and Instagram, and that is at Jordosh, JORDOSH, and that works for any of the platforms. JORDOSH.
Is feministdad.com taken?
I don't even. I think so. I think it was, or else I would have gotten it. So, Feminist Dad. I kind of think it might be taken, but not be anything there. So it's feministdadbook.com.
Who is
Or
that,
maybe.
like a secret feminist dad out there?
Oh, there's certainly. I've discovered there are more than I thought. I thought there were none, and it turns out there are way more than I thought.
Do you have like a Facebook group or some kind of a community around this, or thinking about like creating some kind of a movement? That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I may do that. Right now I'm just sort of focused on getting the word out to the book, and of course the website the feministdadbook.com website will continue to add more and more resources. As we move further into it. The book's still pretty new. It came out right before Father's Day, which was June 20th, and so we did a lot of promotion. Leading up to Father's Day, and now we've sort of been laying low because nobody wants to talk about dads after Father's Day. but we're ready to. We're about to start to push it. I think people will start to see it in a lot of media now again, and then I'll really start to think about the sort of long-term life. Promoting a book is a lot of work, and very, 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 very time consuming. It's sort of I love writing. I'm an intellectual. I love thinking and researching and writing. I don't think most people realize how that once you choose that career of book writing, there's also book selling, and that's the sort of not pleasurable part of the introvert in me who wants to just sit and read and write all day long. But every job has the things that feed your passion, and the things that you have to do to make sure you can keep doing the things that feed your passion.
Yeah, true. But it would be it would be a shame to let this book just die out like this after it came out after the Father's Day, and I think.
Oh, it won't die out.
Yeah, and I think people, maybe book clubs, talk about this and get people interested. I mean, it's not an easy book for
Well, we've already had a lot
to
of
read.
interest from book clubs. I mean, I'm glad you
Yeah,
mentioned that. A lot of
yeah.
book clubs are reading it. A lot of even like women's book clubs. A lot of people have called me and gone, you know what, I've read this book and it really changed the way I think about my husband or my own father. And so I find a lot of women who are like, it makes me kind of go, I wish I hadn't called it How to Be a Feminist Dad, only because it makes it sound like it's really for the dads. But it's unbelievable how many women have said to me, this has totally changed the way I think about my whole relationship with my dad. And I'm actually way more forgiving than I used to be now that I've read this. Because the bottom line is there is nothing like this that has been written in a mainstream voice yet, in a popular voice. Again, there's plenty of academic things that have looked at this, but it is time for men to embrace feminism and gender equality, and to think about their role in gender inequity. And I tried to write a book that made it easy and pleasurable and for them to do that. And I think everybody could handle reading it. Feminism for a long time has been very much attacking men. I mean, I don't want to say, I'm nervous about saying that because I don't want men to be like, yeah, I feel attacked. I mean, the first thing you have to do in any big social movement is deconstruct what's there, right? You have to really break it apart. And that it can be a very aggressive, almost violent process of deconstruction and breaking it down and acknowledging the problems and the failures and the bad things about the cultural system. After that, then we have to start to get into the much more constructive, how do we build it back up phase. And it's time. I think it's time for that. And I don't think men have had the opportunity to go, how can I think about myself in a positive way as part of a gender equity movement? Because there's been too much, I shouldn't say too much, it's the right amount. For too long, it has been so much, how can we see the problems? And now it's time. I think many men see the problems, recognize it, but they don't have a model for how to be the solution.
What a great conversation. Again, thank you so much for being here today. I will promote the book in my community. I think it's a very good book, an important and fresh book. So I'm glad we connected. Have a lovely day. We'll stay in
Thank you.
touch.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This has really been a pleasure.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. What's your biggest takeaway? Did you find it useful? If you are looking for an intellectually stimulating book, I highly encourage you to get Jordan's book. It's not a parenting book, or it's not a how-to parenting book. Instead, it's more like a guide to self-intervention. It urges fathers to change their mindsets, temperaments, and dispositions. It aims to help dads acknowledge the things they do, ordinary, commonplace, run-of-the-mill things that replicate problematic attitudes and strengthens oppressive systems. And of course, you won't be able to eradicate a lifetime's worth of sexist, patriarchal thought patterns by reading this one book, but this is a good start. Let's continue the conversation in our private Facebook group. If you want to get in touch with me, send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. Call the number and leave a voicemail, 732-763-2576. And for you, my international listener, I have a free tool on the contact page of my website, authenticparenting.com/contact. Connect with me and Jordan on Instagram. Take a screenshot of this episode, share it in your stories, and tag us. If you find the podcast helpful and enjoy the content, I would appreciate if you could take a quick second to rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. Until next week, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.